Everybody loves sloths. Whether hanging about in trees or chilling with mammoths and saber-toothed cats, these adorable, famously slow-paced animals are a source of fascination for many people. Sloths, or sloths depending on your preference, are remarkable creatures for many reasons. Their slow metabolisms and low body temperatures allow them to survive entirely on nutritionally poor leaves, while their large, complex stomachs enable them to effectively digest this plant matter. They are masters at avoiding detection by predators by remaining very still and camouflaged, even taking advantage of algae that grows in their fur, giving them a green tinge to help them blend in better with the foliage, as well as making them smell like trees. In fact, sloths actually support an entire miniature ecosystem within their fur, with algae, fungi, insects, and species of moths all calling sloth fur home. Sloths are also surprisingly great swimmers, and despite their slow nature, they can inflict some serious damage with their claws if they need to. But something you may not have known about sloths is that these animals actually evolved more than once. The two types of sloths alive today, the two-toed sloths and the three-toed sloths, might look quite similar overall, but they're actually not very closely related to each other, diverging some 29 million years ago, and both independently evolving to live in trees from ground-dwelling ancestors. This is a fantastic example of a phenomenon known as convergent evolution. This occurs when two or more unrelated organisms are subjected to the same selective pressures. For instance, they may inhabit the same environment or lead a very similar way of life. The anatomical features that best enable an organism to survive and reproduce are the ones that will be selected for, and so two different lineages can end up appearing quite similar as they adapt to live in the same places or to do the same things. We can see this throughout the fossil record of our planet, as well as among lots of living organisms. And we've already looked at how turtles, crocs, moles, and cats have all evolved on more than one occasion. The convergent evolution of the two living types of sloths is another fascinating example of this evolutionary phenomenon. And there are also some instances of other non-sloth lineages that evolved to become pretty sloth-like as well. But first of all, what is a sloth anyway? The closest living relatives of the sloths are actually the anteaters and armadillos. These three lineages are classified together in the superorder Xenarthra, which boasts a very long evolutionary history, likely emerging around 60 million years ago, only 6 million years after the non-bird dinosaurs went extinct, which is not long in geological terms. Xenarthra was also one of the first major lineages to diverge from other placental mammals, making this a truly ancient and distinct group. Xenarthrans originated in South America and subsequently spread to Central America and into North America, with some groups migrating between islands while other lineages expanded further once the continents became connected by land. Among the Xenarthrans, sloths are more closely related to anteaters than to armadillos, together being known as the Pylosans. Sloths became their own distinct lineage sometime probably in the late part of the Eocene epoch, or maybe in the early part of the Oligocene epoch, so between about 36 and 28 million years ago, according to molecular evidence. The sloths that have survived to our modern day are in fact the last remnants of a once very diverse lineage of mammals. 8 different families are currently recognised by scientists, and the extinct members of these lineages were remarkably varied in both their anatomy and their ways of life. Incredibly, scientists have actually been able to study the ancient genomes of extinct sloths, as many of these species died out so geologically recently that some genetic material has remained intact for thousands of years. According to this ancient genetic evidence, one of the oldest branching sloth lineages is that which includes the Caribbean sloths, the superfamily Megalocnoidea. They seem to have diverged from other sloths about 34 million years ago, or just after this time. They managed to colonise the islands of the Greater Antilles by around 33 million years ago, where they remained until they died out just 4,700 years ago. Remains of these sloths have been found in Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba, and they would have been the largest mammals living on these islands, with the largest known species, Megalocnus, potentially weighing about 600 pounds or 272 kilograms. The Megalocnoids are themselves a pretty diverse sloth lineage, being divided into two families that split from one another an estimated 29 million years ago. One of these families, which includes Megalocnus itself, includes members that were ground sloths, with robust, broad bodies and ground-feeding habits. The other family, however, includes species that were potentially tree climbers, or at least spent some of their time among branches. These were smaller-bodied animals than Megalocnus, and had limbs suggesting they were capable climbers, potentially making their way up into the trees to search for food. So, unbelievably, the tree-climbing megalocnoid sloths might have been yet another independent evolution of tree sloths from ground-dwelling ancestors, unrelated to the living ones. However, they would have looked pretty different from our modern species, especially considering they still had quite long tails. Recent studies have disagreed somewhat on the precise relationships of the megalocnoid sloths to other lineages. However, regardless of the exact evolutionary placements, most analyses of the preserved genetic material agree that two other sloth superfamilies can be recognised. These are Mylodontoidea and Megatherioidea. Looking at the Mylodontoids first, there are a couple of extinct families recognised within this lineage, plus the two living species of two-toed sloths, which are contained in the family Chalicotheres. The extinct family Mylodontoidea first appeared approximately 23 million years ago, and includes a wide variety of small to medium-sized ground sloth species. The family survived until just 11 to 10,000 years ago, meaning the last of these magnificent beasts coexisted with the first humans in the Americas. They had interactions with these ancient Americans, which didn't go particularly favourably for the sloths, as evidenced by archaeological sites preserving cut marks made by tools on mylodontid bones, presumably indicating they were a significant source of food for these people. Many different mylodontid species have been discovered, indicating that this was a diverse family, and they were also very far-ranging sloths. In fact, one mylodontid, called Therizinosaurs, even turns up in the North American fossil record from about 10 million years onwards, meaning it reached the continent from South America many millions of years before the Isthmus of Panama formed. So its ancestors must have swum or rafted between islands before eventually reaching the landmass. If you've ever visited the La Brea tar pits, then you'll also be familiar with a mylodontid called Paramylodon, or Harlan's ground sloth, as this is the most frequently uncovered sloth species at the locality, as well as the biggest one to be found here, measuring some 3 meters long, or almost 10 feet, and getting to be about 1.8 meters tall at the shoulder, or nearly 6 feet. Paramylodon lived much more recently than the older Therizinosaurs, and got to North America after the land bridge had formed, rather than island hopping. Another interesting feature of the Mylodontidae family is that some members of this lineage possess small bony plates in their skin known as osteoderms, which contributed to making their hides exceptionally tough. This has been demonstrated by preserved patches of mummified mylodontid skin, such as this amazing piece of mummified skin from Mylodon darwini that was discovered in a cave in Chile, where the cold, dry air of the cavern desiccated it and allowed it to survive intact for thousands of years. The other extinct family that's classified alongside the two-toed sloths and the mylodontids is called Chalicotheres, which includes a number of other diverse species that existed from about 29 million years ago to just 10,000 years ago. Chalicotheriid sloths have yet to be found in North or Central America. These were also very interesting species, with members adapted to a range of environments and feeding styles. And while they could also get pretty sizable, it's the Megatherioid sloth superfamily where the true giants lie. Megatherioidea includes 4 recognised families according to the preserved genetic data, representing another diverse radiation of these marvellous creatures. The family Megatherioidea includes the absolutely gigantic Megatherium and Eremotherium, both of which approached 6 meters, nearly 20 feet in length, and weighed as much as an elephant. While most Megatherioid sloths remained in South America, species such as Eremotherium have also been discovered in the southern reaches of North America, having migrated across the land bridge after its formation. These titanic sloths would not have been creatures you would have wanted to mess with, capable of rearing onto their hind limbs to free up their robust arms and hands, which bore large claws that could be utilised as devastating weapons if the animals needed to protect themselves. However, these formidable defences seem to pose little concern for early humans in the Americas, as preserved evidence of people killing and butchering a Megatherium has been discovered in Argentina. The scattered bones of this immense sloth were found intermingled with stone tools and also bore markings made by these tools as the ancient people cut up the body. Never underestimate a hungry human, I suppose. Megalocnoidea is another megatherioid family that's caused a bit of a headache for researchers, as it used to include a lot of different species that were all classified together based on their skeletal anatomy. But since the genetic data has become available, it turns out that a whole bunch of those species were not actually that closely related to each other. So nowadays the megalocnoids are restricted mainly to Megalonyx itself, plus possibly a few other very close relatives. Megalonyx is a well-known animal due to its historical significance, as well as its prevalence across the North American continent, being found as far north as Alaska. Thomas Jefferson, before he served as president, was the one to name and describe this sloth in 1799, based on fossils of its large claws found in Virginia that had been given to him. Jefferson initially believed he was examining the claws of an enormous cat, suspecting they might belong to some kind of giant lion. In fact, he even instructed Lewis and Clark to search for living examples of his Megalonyx, as he believed there was a possibility they might still exist somewhere in the West. However, after learning about Megatherium fossils discovered in South America, he realized that his giant-clawed creature was another sloth. The species Megalonyx jeffersonii is named after the former president, and was another pretty late surviving and big-bodied ground sloth, dying out only about 13,000 years ago, and growing to around 3 meters or 9.8 feet in length. We also have evidence of human interaction with these magnificent creatures, as a site in northern Ohio documents a very large individual that displays about 41 stone tool marks on a single leg bone. So some ancient humans had very thoroughly sliced this guy up some 13,500 years ago. The third of the extinct megatheroid families is called Nothrotheriidae, and to be honest, this group might just be my favourite, because if you thought that ground sloths in general were kinda strange, then just wait until you hear about the marine sloths. The Nothrotheriids were generally quite small compared to some of the other ground sloths, and primarily dwelled in South America, except for Nothrotheriops, which migrated to North America around 2.6 million years ago, just after the formation of the land bridge. Nothrotheriops shastensis, known as the Shasta ground sloth, is another of the sloth species that turns up in the La Brea tar pits and existed until very recently, becoming extinct only 10,000 years ago. They died out so recently, in fact, that in a cave in Arizona, there is dung and hair from Shasta ground sloths that's only subfossilized, meaning it has not yet had sufficient time to become a full fossil. And the dry conditions of the cave have preserved these remains for thousands of years. Apparently, the dung still smells too. But back down in South America, the Nothrotheriids were getting experimental with their lifestyles. Meet Thalassocnus, the aquatic sloth. These amazing creatures are known from fossils dating to between about 7 to 3 million years ago, from geological formations along the coasts of Peru, Argentina, and Chile. 5 different species of Thalassocnus have been discovered, and even more amazingly, they all appear to form a chronological series, with each species evolving into the next over the course of about 4 million years or so. Thanks to this remarkable record of evolutionary transformation in action, paleontologists have been able to observe how the Thalassocnus species adapted to gradually more seagoing lifestyles. The younger species possessed denser bones than the older ones, an indication that they were becoming more suited to life in the water, as the dense bones acted like ballast to keep them submerged. Furthermore, the older species exhibited wear patterns on their teeth, indicating they were ingesting a lot of sand with their food, so they were presumably feeding on stranded seaweeds and grasses, and possibly venturing into shallow waters to eat. However, the younger species do not display these wear patterns, suggesting they were likely feeding at much greater depths where sand was less likely to enter their mouths. Changes in their limb anatomies are also observable. The later species did not rely on them as much for supporting their weight on land, and the orientation of their feet changed to allow them to paddle more effectively and more easily walk along the bottom of the seafloor. Their claws, too, became more specialized for anchoring onto rocks, helping them to remain stable in the currents, similar to marine iguanas. Thalassocnus also had to contend with some truly terrifying predators in these South American waters, as their bones have been found in the same formations as the formidable macroraptorial sperm whales, and even the big fishy of death itself, Megalodon. Those were some very brave sloths. I don't think I'd be going into those waters. And finally, we come to the last family classified within Megatherioidea, None other than the three-toed sloths, the living family Bradypodidae. Today, 5 species are included within the genus Bradypus, and the family also appears to have a lengthy evolutionary history, with molecular data suggesting that the bradypodid lineage may have split off from other megatherioids some 29 million years ago. The living species themselves also began diverging from one another quite some time ago, potentially at least 17 million years ago, with the maned sloths separating from all the others around that period. In fact, some researchers have actually suggested that the maned sloth should be classified as its own genus, outside of Bradypus, considering these animals are so distinct. The pale and brown-throated sloths also seem to have split from one another anywhere between 6 to 16 million years ago, according to different estimates by studies. So there are some truly deep divergences within this group. Again, I should also stress that a lot of these relationships between the sloth groups are still being worked out by scientists, and even with the genetic data that's been obtained thanks to the recentness of many sloth fossils, there are some disagreements over the precise placement of lineages. So just bear in mind that some of the groupings discussed here can and probably will change in the future. Evolution is a gloriously messy process, and the human urge to classify everything into neat little boxes sometimes means we struggle to comprehend exactly how the process occurred, especially across vast stretches of time. But one thing is for certain, sloth evolution is absolutely fascinating, and what we see today with the remaining tree sloths is but the very tip of an extremely deep iceberg indeed. So to briefly summarise, the living two-toed tree sloths are most likely classified within Mylodontoidea, whereas the living three-toed tree sloths are likely grouped within Megatherioidea, very distant branches on the great sloth family tree, and both evolved from different ancestors that lived on the ground. Considering that we now know the living tree sloths are members of entirely different sloth lineages, are there any signs of this distant relationship in their anatomy? Well, I'm glad you asked, because now let me take you down the rabbit hole of sloth skeletons. Despite looking so superficially similar in their overall body shapes for animals that diverged so long ago, they obviously differ in the number of digits on their forelimbs, but also in the number of their neck bones. Almost all mammals, including humans, have 7 bones in the neck, known as cervical vertebrae. Even in the case of giraffes, with their exceptionally long necks, they still only have 7. They're simply very elongated bones. This is a highly conservative trait among mammals, with only 3 known exceptions to the rule: manatees, which have 6 cervical vertebrae, 3-toed sloths, which possess 8 to 10, and 2-toed sloths, which have 5 to 7. These abnormal cervical numbers seem to have something to do with the slow lifestyles and low metabolic rates of sloths. In most other mammals, having more or fewer neck vertebrae than the standard 7 is strongly selected against, as a deviation from this number results in some nasty side effects, such as an increased risk of cancers and the compression of nerves and blood vessels travelling through the neck. However, the slow metabolism of sloths offers them greater protection from cancers, so that meant that sloths with mutations resulting in different cervical counts were far less likely to die before reproducing, as most other mammals would do, therefore passing on these mutations to their offspring. With their extra vertebrae, the 3-toed sloths also seem to have some functional advantages. They have greater neck mobility, which is helpful for a lifestyle that involves hanging from branches, as they have a broader range to observe their surroundings. In contrast, 2-toed sloths with fewer neck bones experience slightly reduced neck mobility, even though their lifestyles are quite similar. One study also found that the shape of the individual neck bones plays a more significant part in enabling the neck to roll around its long axis, thus providing a better view of the environment, rather than the number of neck bones. So it's still a bit of a puzzle as to why sloths have abnormal cervical counts, but it does show that the 2- and 3-toed sloths are different from one another even in their functional anatomy. Some other anatomical differences between the living sloths include that 3-toed sloths have small tails while the 2-toed sloths lack them. Additionally, sloths have special adhesive tissues that anchor their internal organs to their ribs and pelvis so that they don't compress when they hang upside down. And interestingly, 2-toed sloths have more of these adhesions than the 3-toed sloths, since they spend more time hanging upside down. Plus, they have very different colorations and markings, and 2-toed sloths tend to be a bit larger in size. So then, now that we've had a look at the complex history of sloth evolution, what about the other times that things have evolved into sloths? First of all, Let's travel back in time a bit to a lineage of sloth-like mammals that only went extinct a few thousand to hundreds of years ago. These are the sloth lemurs, members of a family called Palaeopropithecidae. These were incredible animals and are close relatives of the living indriid lemurs of Madagascar, the group that includes the sifacas, the woolly lemurs, and the indri. Sloth lemurs ranged enormously in size, with some about the size of a modern sifaca, while Archaeoindris grew to dimensions rivaling a male gorilla. As implied by the name for this group of lemurs, they appear to have convergently evolved on the sloth body plan to quite a remarkable degree. As lemurs, they would already be suited to life among tree branches, but unlike the living indriids, which are particularly adept at leaping through the trees, many species of sloth lemurs exhibit signs that they spent a lot of time hanging from branches. Their finger bones are strongly curved, a beneficial adaptation for hooking their digits around branches, but they wouldn't have had long claws like sloths. Instead, being primates, they had short nails on their fingers. The genus Palaeopropithecus, the second largest of the sloth lemurs after the massive Archaeoindris, possesses lumbar vertebrae that closely resemble those of living sloths, suggesting that these lemurs were similarly specialized for climbing upside down. Additionally, they fed on leaves, seeds, and fruits. Archaeoindris would have been an exception to this suspensory lifestyle, as at such a size, it likely would not have hung from branches. In fact, historically, this species was even compared to a terrestrial giant ground sloth, indicating that the sloth lemurs had not only converged on the tree sloths, but also on the ground sloths. However, Archaeoindris was probably not as terrestrial as a ground sloth, as it could likely still climb trees, given that its limb anatomy is similar to that of Palaeopropithecus. So despite resembling more of a ground sloth gorilla hybrid, it may have behaved a bit like a giant tree sloth anyway, while still spending a good deal of time on the forest floor. As I mentioned, these sloth lemurs only went extinct very recently, potentially as recently as 500 years ago, although there are some contrasting dates. Consequently, many of these incredible lemurs are known from subfossils, similar to some of the ground sloths, and they would also have interacted with the first humans to arrive on Madagascar, probably being fairly easy prey for these people. In fact, Malagasy stories even speak of a creature known as the Tre, which was likely Palaeopropithecus itself. Sticking with the lemur theme, there was another extinct lemur that evolved from a separate lineage to the Palaeopropithecids and which also has some similarities to the tree sloths. This is Megaladapis, also a pretty sizable extinct tree climber that's been nicknamed the Koala lemur. Like the sloth lemurs, Megaladapis was also a very recent extinction, dying out only within the past 5 centuries or so, and known from subfossils. Megaladapis was very well suited to living among trees, similar to the sloth lemurs, and was probably a slow climber, so again, more like a sloth in its lifestyle than a leaping lemur. Its hind feet were particularly specialized for grasping trees, and it had similarly curved finger bones for hooking onto branches. In addition, they were specialized leaf eaters, much like living tree sloths. The face and head of Megaladapis was clearly not particularly sloth-like, however, with long snouts and eyes positioned on the sides of their heads, rather than fully facing forwards. Another interesting convergence with sloths, though, is that Megaladapis did not have upper incisors, instead relying on a tough pad on the roof of the mouth that the lower teeth worked against to crop leaves. Modern sloths also lack incisors, as well as canines, relying on their simple peg-like cheek teeth to grind up their leafy food. The two-toed sloths do have large and formidable-looking pseudo-canines, however. We're moving further back in time now, as we leave the lemurs and instead turn to another very interesting lineage of prehistoric mammals that show some interesting convergences with the ground sloths. This is one of my favourite groups of any prehistoric mammal, and I'm very excited to talk about them because they're just so gloriously strange. Meet the Chalicotheres. They lived across Africa, Eurasia, and North America and appeared a little under 50 million years ago before dying out some 1.8 million years ago near the start of the Pleistocene epoch. Despite their appearance, looking like some cursed gorilla ground sloth hybrid, they are most closely related to rhinos, tapirs, and horses, as members of the order Perissodactyla, the odd-toed hoofed mammals. Hooves, you may be thinking? Yes, the Chalicotheres evolved from hoofed ancestors but later modified their hooves into claws. The Chalicotheres vary widely in shape and lifestyle, with some species looking distinctly more horse-like, while others, such as the Eurasian Chalicotherium and Anisodon, had very long arms and actually knuckle-walked like a gorilla, with bony pads on the fingers indicating they were putting weight on their knuckles. Such a mode of walking presumably helped to keep their curved claws nice and sharp, and based on analyses of arm musculature, claw wear patterns, and tooth anatomy, these Chalicotheres are thought to have lived in a very similar way to the ground sloths, resting on their haunches and pulling foliage down towards their mouths with their long limbs and hooked claws. So while the sloths were occupying this particular herbivore niche in South America and later North America, the rest of the world had space for the Chalicotheres to evolve a remarkably similar lifestyle. So that's a pretty amazing bit of convergent evolution with the ground sloths. Clearly, this mode of feeding was effective, and served some very different lineages rather well. I also just have to mention another Chalicothere species that's utterly bizarre even for one of these gorilla horse sloths. It's called Tylocephalonyx. It lived around 15 million years ago in North America, and it converged on the Pachycephalosaur dinosaurs, possessing a large dome on its head that may have been used in ramming contests with each other, although that's not 100% confirmed. The Chalicotheres really are fantastic animals. And now, it's time to head even further back in time to a brilliant group of dinosaurs that can be argued to have converged on ground sloths. Or really, ground sloths converged on them, since they evolved a lot later. Anyway, I'm talking about the Therizinosaurs, one of the most unusual lineages of dinosaurs to ever evolve, and my personal favourite dinosaurs. I'm noticing a trend here. I seem to like a lot of very sloth-like animals. These dinosaurs existed throughout the Cretaceous period, likely originating during the older Jurassic, and lived right up until the non-bird dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. The resemblance of certain Therizinosaur species to ground sloths is quite remarkable, with these dinosaurs being primarily herbivorous and using their long, curving claws to hook and pull vegetation towards them. In fact, the paleontologists who study these dinosaurs have been quite apparent about recognizing their similarities to sloths, as a species found in New Mexico called Nothronicus has a name that literally means slothful claw in Greek. Despite evolving from carnivorous ancestors and being related to dinosaurs such as the Oviraptorosaurs and the Dromaeosaurs, the Therizinosaurs were eating plants and getting pretty weird with their body plans. Large bodies, long necks, and relatively small heads meant these animals didn't look much like your typical meat-eating dinosaurs. The most famous of the Therizinosaurs, Therizinosaurus cheloniformis, was an absolute behemoth. Although we don't have particularly complete fossils from this dinosaur, estimates have put it at up to 10 meters in length, 5 meters in height, and potentially more than 5 tons. So that's even bigger than the largest of the ground sloths. A few studies have explored the function of Therizinosaur claws, suggesting that in most species of these dinosaurs, they would indeed most likely have been used to hook and pull branches similar to a sloth. However, Therizinosaurus itself appears to be a special case, as its claws were so extreme in their size and shape that one study found them to be prone to breaking easily when used for strenuous pulling, leading to the suggestion that they might have been display structures only. The Therizinosaurs appear to have mirrored sloths in another way that has only very recently been discovered too. Duonicus sogbatari is a species of Therizinosaur from Mongolia named in April 2025, and unlike all other Therizinosaurs, which have 3 fingers on their hands, this animal had 2 fingers. Duonicus was found to be a highly effective grasper, with strongly curved claws and flexible fingers that enabled it to hook around branches with ease, and like the two-toed sloths, it apparently only needed 2 fingers for this. So the Therizinosaurs are full of surprises and offer another brilliant example of how ground-based hook and pull feeding herbivory is a good way to go about your life. Next up, we're returning to the present day, as believe it or not, there are actually a few other modern non-sloth animals that have kinda converged on the tree sloths. We've already mentioned some extinct very sloth-like lemurs, but another kind of primate that can be considered pretty sloth-like are the slow lorises. These little climbers are native to South and Southeast Asia, and like sloths, they move through the trees very slowly and deliberately, hence the name. However, they do actually move a bit faster than tree sloths tend to. They've also got hands and feet with opposable thumbs and big toes, rather than hooking claws for grasping onto branches. Slow lorises also have low metabolic rates for mammals of their size, again similar to the condition in sloths. However, it appears that the reason for this low metabolism is different in both lineages. Whereas sloths have a slow metabolism so that they may subsist on nutrient-poor plant matter, slow lorises actually have a fairly energy-rich diet, consuming nectar, fruits, and small bugs among other things. So it seems that the slow metabolic rate in these primates might actually enable them to process and get rid of the toxic compounds found in their favoured plant foods. Slow lorises, like sloths, also have very small reduced tails or no tails at all in some species. And they also have facial markings that are somewhat reminiscent of sloths as well. Slow lorises are also renowned for being the only venomous primates, as they have glands on their arms that secrete an oil, which they lick to mix with their saliva, producing a potent venom. Other members of the Lorisidae family, including slender lorises, potos, and anguantibos, could also be considered convergent with tree sloths, as they again are all slow, deliberate climbers, though they are not strictly leaf-eating, low-energy plant feeders, instead consuming a wide range of plants and insects. Moving away from the primates and out of the placental mammals, we can also consider the koala to be the marsupial solution to the tree sloth. Despite being part of lineages that diverged from one another some 160 million years ago, koalas are just like tree sloths in that they are slow-moving, specialist leaf eaters that are incredibly well suited to life in the trees. Once again, they lack tails and have remarkably slow metabolisms, accompanying their relaxed pace of life. This slow metabolism is also due to the same reason as the sloths, since they subsist mainly on leaves. Eucalyptus leaves, the favourite food of koalas, are indeed toxic to most other mammals, but it appears that an increased activity of a specific enzyme involved in blood purification allows them to cope with this toxicity. Like sloths, koalas also possess curved claws for hooking onto branches, but they've still got 5 digits on the hands and feet, and 2 of the fingers are opposable. So koalas are another fantastic instance of convergent evolution with tree sloths, as they adapted to the niche of leaf feeding among the trees in Australia, while still clearly displaying their marsupial heritage in the details of their anatomy. I also just want to feature some honourable mentions of more living species that can sort of be considered convergent with some sloth features, but are also a bit too different to really count. Firstly, colugos are tree-living gliding mammals that are closely related to primates. They primarily feed on leaves and other plant products, a bit like sloths, with long intestines suited to extracting nutrients from their preferred foods. However, considering that they, glide, their herbivory and tree-climbing habits are about where the resemblance to sloths ends. The silky anteater is another almost kinda sloth-like animal, and as an anteater, it's fairly closely related to the true sloths. Found in the Americas, this tiny and adorable little creature is very well suited to life in the trees, with elongate curving claws like a sloth. However, they also have very long and prehensile tails to help them climb, and they don't feed on leaves. They're predators of insects. So there is some convergence on tree sloth-like features, but not to as great a degree as some of the other groups we've looked at. Pangolins are another similar case, as several of these species are able to climb trees. However, it's the African black-bellied pangolins and the white-bellied pangolins, also known as the tree pangolins, that are most suited to this lifestyle. However, apart from the tree climbing habits and the possession of long curved claws, there are not exactly many other similarities between these mammals and the sloths, as they feed on insects, not leaves, have lengthy prehensile tails, and are covered in the distinctive keratin scales that all pangolins possess. Finally, I should also mention the sloth bear. The reason this bear is called this is because early zoologists, when they first encountered the animal, did actually think that it might be a new kind of sloth, apparently due to their fairly slow-moving nature, their long curved claws, and features of their teeth. However, obviously it turned out that these were indeed true bears, and not related to sloths at all. They're also not very slow-moving animals, and while they are good climbers, they mainly eat insects, not leaves. So there we have it, every time that things have evolved into sloths, plus a few times that things almost evolved into them, and a brief overview of sloth evolution itself. I hope you enjoyed learning about all these incredible cases of convergent evolution. Please do let me know in the comments what other instances of convergence you'd like to see me feature next. There are still so many amazing cases to go through, so I'll do my best to cover as many as possible. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to my other channel, 7 Days of Science. Over on this channel, my co-presenters and I make weekly videos covering all the most fascinating science news of the past week. So if you'd like a good way to keep up to date with the latest discoveries, you might like what we do over there. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss the next upload, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.